You almost died. You experienced a loneliness, a darkness that I've witnessed with my own patients, where you're just barely holding on to the ledge of life, the dark abyss behind you. And I want you to help our audience, many of whom actually might feel that way, like the world's falling apart around them, who are struggling and feel isolated and lonely, how they can change that reality. How did you do it?
Well, I had a lot of help from a lot of people. That was the major part of it, I would say, is my family, my parents, my wife, my daughter, my son, my close friends, my extended family. They all stepped up in a remarkable way. Many people went way above the call of duty, I would say. I think they went farther for me than I might have for them, to my chagrin, let's say. So that's a huge part of what helped me, and my wife too, when she was so sick. So many people were so helpful. And part of that, I suppose, was that she allowed that help to occur. You know, she understood that there are times when you're facing something that's so far beyond you in some sense that there's no possibility of you handling it alone, and that if people offer their aid, then you can accept. And there's a lurking reciprocity in that, right? Is that the idea is that, well, perhaps you would be there under similar circumstances for someone else. That keeps the scales balanced. But a large part of that is saying yes when people say that they will help.
How did you deal with the loneliness that happened in your own life when you lost control, at least the control you thought you had over simple things like, am I going to hurt myself? And how does that, the tools you used to get through this, how does that shine a path for the rest of us to get through the loneliness, the anxiety that is epidemic right now in America?
Well, I suppose attending very carefully to the relationships that you do have, and trying, if you're lonesome, trying to extend them to. Ben Franklin said, this is something quite wise, if you move to a new neighborhood, one of the most appropriate things to do to begin with is to ask someone nearby for a small favor. Right? Nothing too big, but then that allows them to do something nice, which is a gift to them in some sense. And then, well, you're also now under an obligation to reciprocate, and that can start that process going, right? Because a friendship, and a personal relationship for that matter, an intimate relationship, is a series of exchanges. And so you might think you have to initiate that with a small gift, but perhaps you could ask instead. And so that's wise. And if you're lonely, well, you have to make the attempt to meet people. And you do that slowly and badly and try to learn as you go. I mean, partly if you're trying to solve a problem like loneliness, you think, well, I need more people in my life. Okay, well, that's more people in my life. That's pretty vague and abstract. It's like, well, I need a friend. Okay, well, that's still pretty hard, but that's at least only one person. I need to say something nice today to the shopkeeper down the street. Maybe tell them who I am, give them my name, ask them their name, right? I mean, one of the things that I learned to do, because I moved many times, was when I moved to a new location, is I would pick a few places and then go to them once a week as a routine and get to know the people there. And so when I moved to Toronto, for example, I went to this little cafe, bar, hangout for students that was colloquially known as the Dive. And it had karaoke, and it was not a fancy place, but it was a place where students would go, and so it was kind of comfortable, and we got to know the people who ran it. And we went there diligently every week for like a year, and that put a little stake in the ground, you know. It was a place that we could start to predict and know. And when you move somewhere new, or if you're alienated where you are, that's what you have to do, is you have to put these stakes in the ground and then learn the nature of that territory. And you can do that. People are almost always open to a friendly exchange. And if you don't think that's true, then I would say perhaps your social skills aren't what they could be, and you need to work on that. I mean, as a behavioral psychologist, I used to practice with some of my clients just how to say hello and to introduce themselves. You have no idea how many people don't know how to do that.
How do you do that? What's the right way to say hello?
Well, let's do it.
All right, let's do it.
Sure. So Hi, I'm Jordan Peterson.
Mehmet, it's a pleasure.
Very nice to meet you.
Good to meet you
Yeah,
as well.
and so what do? Well, you put your hand out and you smile and you look the other person in the eyes a little bit, and you have a reasonably firm grip, and you want to be friendly, and you're opening the door here and offering what would you say, the possibility of trust.
And the mistakes,
it's a big deal, that.
The mistakes people make, and I'll just bring it up because I taught my kids this, most parents try to, look them in the eyes.
Yeah.
It has to be a firm handshake, not trying to hurt the person.
Right.
But that's, I think, symbolic because we're not armed.
Yeah.
If you're shaking someone's hands.
Yeah, but you want to show that there's some commitment there, right? It's and you don't want to make them uncomfortable by offering them like a dead fish, and these are very important. These initial rituals are extremely important, and often people who haven't been well socialized, let's say, who weren't fortunate enough to have good parents, let's say, or sophisticated parents, the fact that they really don't know how to do that, it's like, they're lonesome, because how do they get it going? These things are so important. And so, well, that's a very good start. And you could do, I had a friend who was a master at this, man. He was so good at this. We used to go to shops everywhere I went with him. He went clothing shopping with me another number of times. He's an artist, and he liked to do clothing shopping. And he would walk into a store, and the first thing he would do when he was engaged in an interaction to buy something was take like 10 seconds to have a little personal interaction with the person who was selling. And he'd just say, like, what's your name and how are you doing today? And he meant it, right? This wasn't some manipulative game. It was a mark of his extreme social skill. And the person would be so happy that this happened, then the whole interchange would be extremely pleasant and they'd be unbelievably helpful. And then we'd get exactly what it was that we were coming for. And then it was also a pleasure. And it was partly because his social skills were just so good. He put the person at ease right away. Instead of being harsh with them or anything like that, he took just that really 10 seconds to frame the interaction properly. And so I learned a lot from watching him.
Are there mistakes that you notice people make in that simple little interaction that you're describing that most of us would never think twice of? A dismissive comment, not acting sincere, or actually not believing that it's important what you're doing, because I think it sort of is.
Well, they don't trust. They assume that they don't, and they may not even notice this assumption, that they're distrustful of what the other person might do, and then that's broadcast. And so you might say, well, trust is for the naive. It's like, no, that's not trust. That's naivety. So imagine a small child who's never, fortunately, had to face anyone malevolent or deceptive or manipulative. They trust. Well, we're not 4-year-olds, and we know that people can be full of snakes. We're full of snakes ourselves. We know that. So how can you be such a damn fool that you would trust? And the answer is because you're courageous, not because you're naive, not because you don't know that things couldn't go wrong, because they could, but if you trust, you open the door to the best side of that person. Some people will slam that door in your face, but very, very few people. And, they usually have plenty of issues, and maybe you don't want to get tangled up in that, but most 95% of the time, it'll work. And if you get good at it, it'll work like 99.9% of the time, because you'll even be able to charm people who are themselves distrustful and who won't respond to that invitation without skepticism and mistrust.
How do you deal with conflict? When you were ill, there were times we would periodically speak, or I'd be speaking to your family, even more than you, about what was going down, and there was clear conflict happening with people wanting to help, but moving in opposite directions. And that's true in our lives, even if we're not fighting off a bad addiction. For the many people who are isolated, in part because they have conflicts in their life that they can't resolve. Do they just make new friends? Do they write off old friends? Or do they try to fix those relationships? And that's, I guess part of it is what is forgiveness? And I don't think forgiveness is saying what you did was okay. I think forgiveness is saying, I have a problem with what you did, but I'm not going to let it block our relationship, which is especially important between parents and children.
Well, I guess the first thing you do is you figure out what you want. Well, what do you want? If you have any sense, you want peace. Because wouldn't it be something if you could have that? And so you try to make sure that that's actually what you want, and not victory, and not moral superiority, and not what would you say, gratification that you were right and they were wrong. All of that's just going to get in the way. And then you have to think through the nature of the problem. What's exactly the problem here? And what would you like to see as a solution? If you could have the solution you wanted, what would it be? Well, that'll set the frame properly. And then you ask yourself, okay, well, I need to broach this topic, and God, there's more elephants under the carpet than I know what to do with, and snakes in the rafters. It's a terrible situation to walk into. Is there some small step I can take to just begin the process? And you wait and you hope that you get an answer. I suppose that's something vaguely reminiscent of prayer. It's like, God, grant me the possibility of finding the appropriate words to broach this situation. But, a lot of it has to do with your intent, and that's not an easy thing to straighten around, because if you're in a conflict, you're angry and you want to be right and you want to win, and, you want to hurt the other person because you're mad at them, and all of those are impediments to peace. And why would you not want peace? Okay, well, because you're resentful and you're angry at life, and, it's very, very hard to resolve conflict. But just think what you can have if you resolve it. You can be aligned with people whose interests are aligned with yours, and you can cooperate without all of the terrible stress that unresolved issues lay on all of us. And it's a very difficult thing to manage, but it's a good thing to aim for. And you hope you have the humility and the goodness of spirit and the clarity of mind and the pureness of heart to set your ambitions correctly when you walk into the fray, and that you're courageous enough not to just avoid the fact that the conflict is there. And then maybe you pick the time too when you're reasonably well rested and not angry and not hungover and not, hungry. That's another one. And you plan it carefully.
Why do you think you're the most popular psychologist in the world right now?
Well, I was educated by good people, so that's part of it. I had a good education at McGill when I was being trained as a clinical psychologist.
But those people who educated you aren't as well known as you, nor are they perceived as compelling. And of course, with adoration comes, a whole slew of people who detest you. I've actually always tried to understand why that was the case as well. You must think about this. I'm sure in the... I'm not...
think about nothing else, but yes.
The greatest thinkers of our time have struggled emotionally. Nietzsche, obviously, the classic example.
Well, I include myself in the population of idiots that I'm talking to. I think, in some sense, I get away with giving advice. Well, partly I'm not really trying to give advice. I'm trying to straighten things out in my own life, and I'm sharing the process of doing that with other people. When I lecture, for example, I'm not lecturing. It's not the right word. Mm-hmm. I usually have a question in mind that I don't understand. So when I sit before a lecture, I don't lecture with notes anymore. I have a question that I don't really understand. It's a hard question, like, how do you make peace with people in your family? It's like, oh my God, that's a hard question. Do I have the answer to that? Well, no definitive answer, that's for sure. Well, could I walk through the exploration of that problem? Yes. And then I verbalize what I'm thinking, and that pulls people along through the process of attempting to understand, explore, and address the problem. And I'm not talking down to people. I don't do that because I don't believe that I'm above other people. And in my clinical practice, I dealt with an incredibly wide variety of people, ranging from people who are so impaired that they had trouble with the simplest of tasks, folding in a paper to put inside an envelope, for example, which is way more complicated than you think. If you watch someone who can't do it, it takes a remarkable degree of precision to fold a paper in three precisely to fit it inside an envelope, to people who were, had world-class level intellects, all that entire range, and walked through a very large set of problems with them. And I was trained too, partly, as a clinician, to break things down into simple steps. The behaviorist psychologists were really good at figuring out the necessity of that and making things concrete. And the more psychoanalytically oriented people that I studied repeated time and time again that you have to lead people to draw their own conclusions. And so I think the other reason, perhaps, that I've managed to attract some public attention, mostly positive, thank God, is that I actually listen to people. And I listen to people because they actually know some things I don't know. And the fact that there are things I don't know makes my life worse than it might be. And I don't want it to be any worse than it might be. So, like, if I can learn something from someone, and you just never, if you really interact with someone, I don't care who they are, there is something you'll learn if you handle it properly. I learned plenty from dealing with, well, when my clients who are more intellectually impaired. So I learned lots from dealing with them. Like how the world treats people like that, for example, and why, and what obstacles they encounter and how they overcome it, and what the difference is in people in terms of their intrinsic ability, and how that plays out in each of our individual fates and in society in general, and many, many things.
I understand the power of what you're saying, in part because you say it so well. I'd love to understand from you why you think it bothers some people so much. It just seems...
Well, I get shunted into the class of political enemy, and then the people whose ideology inclines them to do that really don't listen to what I'm saying. They just have already made up their mind, and so I'm just another person who's in the basket of deplorables, and maybe I'm a leader of that. And so it's just casual ideological us and them.
It just seems like your enemies fear you more than they fear most people, or more angry at you than they would be at most people who would say what you're saying.
Well, so apart from just the conceptual confusion that I'm lumped in with, say, radical right-wingers somehow, because I've objected to radical left ideology and its role in destroying the universities in large part. There's something else going on there too that isn't merely a matter of ideological distinction, let's say, and the tendency to politicize everything. This, if you go deep down into the culture wars, especially as they've been raging in the humanities, and this is especially true, I believe, of the thought that came out of France, Foucault, Derrida, and the postmodernist crew, who were addressing a very real problem, by the way.
Which is?
The fact that everything is so complex that there's an almost endless number of valid interpretations of everything that goes on. It's like, well, if that's true, and it appears to be true even at the level of perception, how do we know which interpretation is reasonable, correct, or true? It's a huge problem. And it bedeviled many fields simultaneously. So in AI, for example, when people were trying to make intelligent machines and robots, they came head on into the problem of perception. Because it turns out that the world isn't just simply made out of objects, the objects that we see. It's not like that at all. And so how to categorize things is an incredibly difficult problem. No one really has any idea how we do it.
So they're struggling to figure that out.
Yeah.
In the meantime, they're espousing a philosophy which most people didn't even appreciate was happening.
Yes, well, there's another element to it, is that when you make categories, you distinguish between things, and you do that on the basis of value, at least to some degree, because you want to see things that are useful and good, and dispense with things that are useless and bad. And so built into the process of perception and categorization is judgment, and judgment involves exclusion. And so, well, being excluded is obviously painful in many situations, but there's no escaping it if you're going to categorize. Okay, so that's all still a straightforward intellectual problem in some sense, and philosophical. But underneath that, even, there's something else going on, which is an assault on the idea of categorization itself. And really, in some sense, that's what's being played out way down deep below all the political trouble. And it's part of, I hate to say this, but it's part of the battle, in some sense, the mythological battle between good and evil. And so some people have an inkling of that. And I'm on the side of discriminatory categorization, which doesn't mean that I think people should be arbitrarily judged and discarded. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with making careful distinctions between what is good and what is not. And we are bound to do that. It's part of the act of perception itself. There is no escaping the necessity of value judgments, and there's a higher and a lower. Because there's no value judgment without higher and lower. And there's no action without value judgment. So there is a hierarchy of value, and I say that very clearly. And there's something at the top. And so, well, that's not a happy idea for the people who oppose that. And so, and they see, to some degree, that which side of that I'm on, let's say. And, well, that's a problem.